Exodus chapter 1. After 2+ years of studying in Genesis, we end with Israel, the children of Israel, dwelling in Goshen, portion of Egypt. And now we're going to read about them coming out. So, as far as the starting point, Exodus comes from the idea of exit. We've got a sign back by the door that says exit. That tells us where we can go out. And that's what Exodus amounts to. It means the going out or the way out. So, beginning, we will read a few verses here. It says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. And all the souls that were out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. For Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them." Now we'll pause at this point. This is the opening up of the story, we'll say. And actually, as far as some writers that I was reading after, in the Hebrew, what they're saying is that the first verse actually began with what we would call the word "and." In other words, it would be almost a continuation of Genesis, which it is, but it is a separate book. But it's like, and now these are the names of the children of Israel. No stopping point, in other words, from Genesis into Exodus. But we do know that there is some time that has passed here. And we'll look at that as we go along here. So, first it names the sons of Israel. And it speaks of how that it says every man and his household came with Jacob. So, there were a lot of people. Now it mentions 70 souls, meaning the children of Israel and their households was numbered at 70. I don't know if that is children, grandchildren, the blood kin only, or if that includes servants. I'm kind of thinking that perhaps there was more servants that was not considered here, but it says that there were 70 that went in. When we get further down the line, we're going to find that it was thousands that went out. Actually, the number being in the millions. So whenever that it speaks here in the 7th verse, it says the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. I like that last phrase. The land was filled with them. So, it's like everywhere you looked, here was an Israelite. It's kind of what it was bringing across here. Of course, they were positioned or located in what was known as the land of Goshen, which is in the Delta region. A very good region for herdsmen, which is what Israel and his family, that was their livelihood, their business. They were herdsmen, shepherds. And when it says, and again it says fruitful. Now, it could have stopped there. It says, the children of Israel were fruitful, and the land was filled with them. But we find the descriptive term just kind of stacks one on top of another. Not only fruitful, but it says in describing this fruitfulness that they increased abundantly. Okay, we understand that. But it doesn't stop there. It says, and multiplied. I mean, it just keeps going on here. And then it says, waxed exceeding mighty. Brother Eric, what does waxed mean?
Again.
Okay. I knew you do, so.
Yeah.
But they were growing and they gained as far as expansion in the numbers. So this little verse is just in a probably a wordy way, because of all these descriptive terms, is getting across the fact that these folks, they were growing and expanding and becoming very numerous. We studied Abraham, and Genesis 12, Genesis 17, there's both references there. Lot was, we'll say, a portion of the covenant, the promise that God made with Abraham.
That they would multiply.
Descriptive term there, the stars of the sky, the sand of the sea. And so this verse basically is telling us this is coming to pass. And I mean, it wasn't finished, but we see the promise in effect, and it was coming to pass here. So, a heap of words used to express the vast increase of Israel in Egypt. That's what one writer put down, and I think that was a pretty good description. A heap of words. They were prospering, and that was basically God's intent. Now, remember though, they were in Egypt. And here is these Hebrews living in this choice area of Egypt. What was the relationship between the Egyptians and the Hebrews?
They didn't like each other, but when Joseph was alive, the king at that time loved Joseph and saw how smart he was, and so he gave him a lot of leeway to the land, but he didn't live. So now they're under a new ruling, a new king who's like, oh my gosh, these people are taking over. So we need to put a halt to this.
Yeah.
And then that's when all the trials basically started.
So God used Joseph kind of as leverage to overcome the
Factor.
Yeah.
Factor, I would call it, because
Yeah. God used Joseph to overcome the views and opinions of the Egyptians toward the Hebrews. And I mean, the Hebrews probably wasn't too happy toward the Egyptians either. But I think, as we have studied in the past in Genesis, that the Egyptians, they looked down. They didn't want to eat with them. They didn't want to socialize with them. There was this stigma toward the Hebrews. So the 8th verse says, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. That tells one that there had been some time had passed. How much? Don't know. But for one thing, a new king. A new king would have been a successor to the Pharaoh that knew Joseph and appreciated Joseph. It could have been a Pharaoh rise up of a different area of Egypt that maybe had heard of Joseph and had benefited in some way, because Joseph was used of God to save the people, the nation, but would have been at a distance. This could have been a pharaoh that was of a different people, because the Egyptians over time, historically, there were times that other people came in and overran Egypt. So there's some ifs there. But the fact remains that this new king rose up as Pharaoh over Egypt. As such, let's think of things perhaps more updated. When we get a new president, what's the first thing they do?
Do what the president before did.
You got it. I mean, they pick out a new cabinet. They look at different areas of the government, of the heads of those various offices or departments. And, some a president cannot do anything about, but some that they can. And also policies that was established before, especially if it's a change in the party, as we say, they try to unravel as much of that as they can and establish theirs. Well, you think that's anything new? No. Here's, this Pharaoh comes and he's the new Pharaoh. Okay, if there is some monument or something that he can, because some things you don't touch, we understand that. But, it's possible, they used to go around and chisel out their little stories in stone. Well, I kind of rub that down a little bit. Kind of put the old Pharaoh out of the people's minds. And with the Egyptians, because they were an adulterous people, they worshipped many gods, and some of them were kind of spooky looking if you've ever seen pictures of them. But they worshipped many gods. A new Pharaoh would want to establish his gods in many cases. And of course that would be absorbed into the many other gods that the Egyptians worshipped. But I mean, every phase of society, the Pharaoh, because he was Pharaoh, he would put his stamp on. So it's very possible that even Joseph, even if he was following the Pharaoh that favored Joseph and dealt with Joseph, if it was even the next Pharaoh in line, maybe it was like, hey, I don't want any of this affecting my reign. I want people to remember me and not the Pharaoh that followed Joseph. So there's some different ideas that can come in here, but the fact was that it says that he knew not Joseph. Whether it was a few years down and time had kind of, made things fuzzy in the memory of people, or whether it was the fact he did not want to know Joseph or the people to know Joseph.
Well, it had to be a long time before this one came up, because in verse 6 it says, and Joseph died and all his brethren and all that generation. So that had to be, to get through that generation, had to be quite a while. Wouldn't that?
Generation in the Bible is what, 70 years?
But look at it. Joseph was what? As far as in his generation, out of his brothers, there's 12 of them.
He was the youngest,
He was
Yeah.
the
or
youngest.
next to the youngest.
Okay.
Oh, that's true.
So
Okay.
the other ones could have passed away quite
Before.
shortly after him. Okay, because he was the youngest, so, it would have been different if he would have been the oldest and there was 20
You
or
don't
30
forget
years.
somebody, it would take a few years
Well,
before.
a few years, but not necessarily, but it doesn't really say how long the Pharaoh lived after Joseph either. Okay, it was there with
Yeah, but the
Joseph,
people
so,
there would have remembered Joseph, so I'm thinking, I'm thinking of my age limit.
Do your children remember Truman as president?
No, I don't remember Truman.
I mean, that's basically
Well, let's go to another step. Do they remember Kennedy?
Yeah.
Because Kennedy wasn't, you know,
I mean, that's, you know, you got Eisenhower. I remember Ike, you know. But anyway, I mean, now, it doesn't take too long. And wasn't it Reagan that said that we were just one generation away from tyranny?
Yeah.
You know, so it takes a period of time. So some time had passed, whether it was 50 years, whether it was 70 years, whether it was 100 years, somewhere in that era would be possible. But the thing was that here was a Pharaoh that took no appreciation of the fact that there was even an Egypt for him to be Pharaoh over. Because if it had not been for Joseph, and actually for God using Joseph, Egypt would have perished as well as a lot of the others because of the magnitude of that famine that they went through. So it doesn't tell us a lot here, and you know just how critical that is, but it's just something to think about, that there was some time passed, and this new king knew not Joseph. So, you know, he was probably following a different philosophy as far as the Pharaoh. Maybe he established a different system of governing. I mean, he was going to be head naturally, but you know, the Pharaoh could shake things up. So, anyway, the 9th verse says, "And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." Have we heard that in our time? We don't want to get into politics here, folks, but it's the same. When you have a large number of, we'll say foreigners, immigrants, that come into an era, a certain area of location, people take note of that and they begin to kind of look things at, wow, they're taking over. And that is how the Egyptians viewed this. Keep in mind, I don't have my map out here, but most of Egypt was separated from what we call the Promised Land, which that's where the trade routes went, right up through the Promised Land. So most of the Egyptians, there was a buffer, in a sense, between them and that Promised Land. And that buffer included the land of Goshen. And what was not only were they numerically growing and becoming a great population. And you know something that we don't see it here as much as when Sri and I were down in Colorado. In Denver, there's, the issue was always, well, people from Mexico coming in. Well, it wasn't just Mexico. It's all over the world down there. It is a cosmopolitan type of metro area. I mean, just the little hardware store that I worked in there in Aurora, we had folks from, yes, we had a lot of Hispanics, but we had people from Africa, we had people from Eastern Europe, we had people from Asia that frequently came into the store. They were in the neighborhood. It was just, and there was a lot of talk, about what's going on here, how the neighborhood is changing. That's what the Egyptians were seeing in their day. The neighborhood is changing. So, and not saying good, bad, or ugly on that, it's just the way it is. So he says that they're more and mightier than we. Now we just read where that, over and over it's saying how that they were increasing and multiplying. And, this little family grew immensely. and it caught the attention of this new Pharaoh. So the 10th verse says, come on now. That gets your attention, doesn't it? It says, come on, let us deal wisely with them. So he had a plan. Politicians always have a plan, don't they? And Pharaoh was no different. They said, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. So, he says, let us deal wisely. Wisely there is, for one thing, that it means to be shrewd, or shrewdly, deal shrewdly with this people. Be tactful here. And also that, let's put a push on this. There was some aggressiveness involved in this statement here, to deal wisely with them. And it wasn't just to keep them at bay, but also how can we as Egyptians benefit from them? How can they benefit Egypt? And we're going to see here how all this comes into play. But let us deal wisely with them. And the reason, unless they multiply, and they were anyway, and it come to pass, it says, there falleth out and war, and they join with our enemies. There again, keep in mind, here's Egypt. Here is the Delta area, where the land of Goshen is located. And then you go up into what we refer to as the Holy Land, the Promised Land. But on north of there, you didn't go really east very far from the Promised Land, because that was this desert, harsh, a place that people would not want to travel through. That's why they kept along this narrow band of land that we know as Israel today. But north of there, you run into Syria. You run on further north into what we call Asia Minor, or today is Turkey. And that was the headquarters of what was known as the Hittite Empire. Now, we studied about the Hittites before. Abraham dealt with the Hittites. They were dwelling down in the Promised Land even. So here were other nations that were to the north that would, by the natural highways and byways, would travel down into Egypt to try to overthrow them. And again, who stood between, we'll say, the Hittites and Egypt? It was the people of Israel. And what the Pharaoh was thinking here and presenting to the people is, hey, what's to keep these Israelites, these children of Israel, from joining the Hittites or any other people coming down from the north and fighting against us? And they're so numerous anyway. That would put fear in people. And make it a lot easier for Pharaoh to establish his agenda, we'll say. So, the 11th verse says, therefore, he had his reasoning here. They're numerous. They could turn against us. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramsey. Now, okay, first of all, taskmasters. What does that tell you? Is it foreman? Someone that watched over, it became organized. Because taskmasters would be over a group, a certain number. whether it be 100 or 1,000 or whatever, these men were, we'll say they were managers or foremen to watch over this people as they worked and labored. Remember what? In dealing wisely with them, it wasn't just a matter of muffling them down, where that they wouldn't be a danger as far as being numerically, but let's benefit from them as well. And how was it that Pharaoh benefited? Well, he put them to work. It says they built for Pharaoh treasure cities. So ultimately, who's benefiting to begin with here?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh. That's right. So he's dealing wisely, right? Shrewdly. You know. And, I mean, he's ruler. And that's how they do many times. So they put the taskmasters over them. Now, these taskmasters, I've always just figured this was Egyptians. You know, men of maybe importance, of influence, or, you know, whatever. I have read where some think that these taskmasters were actually drawn from the Israelites. I don't know. To me, I see the Egyptians. The matter remains, it was taskmasters over them. To make them work, to set them at a task. And it wasn't just that they threw them out there and said, go to work. They had to have a plan. You know, when you're building a city, you have to have a plan, a blueprint to follow. So these taskmasters, you know, they were educated and they were perhaps experienced in construction to begin with. But what was their purpose? To afflict them. To afflict them. And what is affliction? Something that hurts, isn't it? We say we're afflicted. You hit a certain age and there's what? Arthritis. We're afflicted with arthritis. We're afflicted with, you know, aches and pains. And we use the term affliction because it's associated with aches and pains, hurts, something that we feel is harming us physically. Here, the whole idea was we're going to benefit materially, but we're going to bring hurt to them as well. So, you look through history and you find that where people come in and one nation conquers another nation, one king conquers another kingdom, one country, one nation. And what happens many times to the citizens? They basically become in bondage. I mean, look back at Germany, World War II previous to that. What happened to the Jews there? You know, the nation, we say Hitler because he was the leader of the nation, but he began to afflict the Jews. And what did they do? They went to slave camps to begin with. And then finally it got to the point he just started killing them off. There's Stalin in Russia. Basically the same story there. And that was with his own people. If they would send them, you know, send them to Siberia, we know that wasn't good. So a lot of people were in forced labor. And that's what we see here with the children of Israel to begin with, forced labor. Because they weren't craftsmen. There may have been some craftsmen amongst them, but by nature and tradition, what were they?
Shepherds.
Shepherds, herdsmen.